Hello and welcome to The Healing Way. My name is Richard Clark, and on this video I'll be talking about the differences between perception and understanding and how they apply to healing, which is what I'm concerned with. Starting with understanding, the processes that we use at the moment are mainly understanding based, and it's mainly to do, well, I think the scientific view is an offshoot of this, but it started once we started using our minds more analytically centuries ago, and this gave rise to the scientific method and the objective method, the objective viewpoint, and to look at a thing through analysis. So we have a problem, and the problem's in front of us, and we abstract like an artificial construct. We label the problem, then we abstract that construct into our minds. It becomes a mental object. We're no longer looking at the problem, we're looking at what's in our heads, and from analysing what's in our heads we come to a point of understanding it. This seems to me to be somewhat narrow, because it depends on what you abstract, what's abstracted, and the labelling process, what gets left out. It's not very good for the long term. By that I mean long-term consequences are not really seen. It is very much a short-term solution to a problem, and it has to be said it has worked very well. Mainly because I think the long-term problems or the long-term side effects of what is going on with something isn't seen. It isn't seen. This is all it's based on eyesight. It's based on what we actually see with our eyes, and as I say, it's an image of what we see with our eyes is abstracted into our minds as a mental object, and that mental object is analysed, studied, and hopefully a person will reach a state of understanding. Now, in the background of all this is isolation. The first thing we do is isolate ourselves from what we're seeing. So there is separation. There's separation, there's isolation. So this process needs or wants to act in isolation. Now, another thing that's done here is perception is switched off. Now, what is perception? Perception is the perceiving of the truth. What we perceive is truth, the truth of the situation in all its glory. The whole thing is just laid out to perception, and all the consequences can be seen, short term, long term. If you do this, this happens. And even if you say, okay, I need to do this, and I can see there's long-term consequences, with perception you can do the short-term thing, but then you're able to you can apply perception continually to the process as the long-term problems arise. That's perception, the perception of the truth. Right? Now, without perception, we've got this analysing, analytical, studying, thought processes leading to understanding. But we never see the consequences. We never see what our actions are going to lead to. So therefore, everything is good. If you get rid of something in somebody through a scientific method, some scientific discovery, you get rid of something, it's great. It's a breakthrough. We don't see the consequences, we don't see the side effects, no matter what they are. So we're living in it's a very one-sided way of looking at things. My view is we need perception. We need perception as part of a process. First of all comes contact. We see what's going on. By see, I mean we perceive. Perception can only come through joining with somebody, not physically joining, but being part of, you know, part of the world, part of the life's processes. So we join with our surroundings, or we're connected to our surroundings, and through that connection there is perception. That's from the person going out. Then there is a feedback. That feedback is realisation. Realisation comes back. After realisation, there's an insight into what we're realising, and this leads to actions. Now, it's a completely different process. There might be, at some point down the line, a place for where thought and understanding enters, isolation enters. But the thought isolation processes are very much of the physical world. They're very much of the physical world. If you're studying the physical, if you want to have a better understanding of the physical, that's where these things come in. But to understand things that can only be perceived, or rather to have an insight or an inquiry or an investigation, a realisation into things that can only be perceived, then there has to be, as I say, this process of joining and connecting, and then the perception can start. There is a lot wrong, or a lot that could be put right with our actions, but it is not further thought, further understanding that's going to do it. It is by bringing back perception, letting it switch on. Now that's an interesting idea. Why was it switched off in the first place? Well, perception is the seer of truth, the seer of what is. Right? We see what is through our perception, but we switch it off. We switch off seeing what is, and then we abstract some artificial idea of what is, of what truth is, and then we try and study it in our minds, thought objects, mental objects. So why would we do that? Well, perception doesn't just perceive, it dissolves lies, for want of a better way of putting it. It dissolves away what isn't real. It sees what's real, what's actual, and what isn't real, what is a construct, what is a belief, what is an idea, it dissolves. Like light in the darkness, light dissolves darkness. And this is what the mind is afraid of. This is what it lives in fear of. That it's isolated itself so that it can live in darkness. It's this whole concept, this whole idea of analysing and studying and being objective isn't the point. The point of all this is to protect fear. It's to protect a way of being afraid. Because it's separation, it's isolation, it's living in darkness. And that is why the perception has to be turned off. Right? Turning it back on is for the brave. It's for the people who say, well, I can see that now, I can see that this isn't a way to live. It's, don't get me wrong, it's not either or. There's nothing wrong in being able to analyse it if it's part of the greater picture. If it's part of something greater, the perceptions, the insights, the realisations, the revelations, contemplation, the whole thing that the mind can do when it isn't narrowed down and just focused to being separate and objective. Scientific, it's called. Okay, so switching back on perception is for the brave, because the brave will want to use it and look. They'll want to say, okay, perception is seeing the truth. Seeing the truth dissolves the lies, dissolves the false. And in that I will change, because that perception won't just look out, it will look in. It will look everywhere. There'll be nothing that isn't seen. And when it looks and it sees falseness, that falseness will dissolve. And what is being protected inside that gives rise to the separation is false. is falseness. It's an abstraction. It's an idea about what we are, which is lies. There is no idea of what we are. There is the truth of what we are. But the idea of what we are is simply a mental abstraction. All these ideas and beliefs that I have about myself are just artificial. They're just something I've created through my life, and it's the same for everybody. We've created all these ideas and beliefs about ourselves, and the only way to preserve them, to protect them, is to have them in isolation, to switch off perception, which we do, and then to make a virtue out of being separate, which we do. We call it science. The scientific way to observe objectively. But it can only work, it's a fine, I mean, you look at civilization and society, there's very, very clever people out there, but it needs to be part of something greater, the greater whole. It needs to integrate into the bigger, much bigger thing, much, much bigger. And then it will have guidance. There'll be, yes, I can use it in this place, it's appropriate, or I won't use it in this place because it's not appropriate. It needs something greater, something more insightful, deeper, more meaningful. Because my healing work it sweeps right the way through, right from energy that can't be perceived, down to the physical, the very, very obvious physical, let's say, the physical that's in front of our faces. Right? But from the energy that can't be perceived, right the way through all the different energy layers and levels, until it gets to the point where energy changes into the physical, right? All that needs perception. You cannot see it, you cannot measure it, I don't think we ever will. But that needs insightful perception, because that has such an impact on our life. Yeah? It's such an impact on our life, and if we don't understand it, if we don't perceive it, and from those perceptions gain insight into how it works and how our actions on the physical world change it and affect it, which then feeds back and affects us, we're in big trouble. To be honest, we're in big trouble anyway. I mean, we are. It is close to midnight for us. We really need to wake up to our actions, what we're doing. This can't go on. I do not perceive a happy ending unless we mend our ways, unfortunately. And even simple things about the harm, the massive harm that drugs do to us. And I'm not talking about what they call recreational drugs. I'm talking about prescribed drugs that people take without a second thought. You see, on the physical level, there's no harm. You can't see it. But on the energy level, there's tremendous damage going on. But we can't perceive that. Very few of us can perceive that. And those of us who do perceive it feel there's not a lot of people listening, you know. But I think it's good. It's good for the individual. It's to start to perceive things more. I think that is the way forwards. Okay, and as I say, it's not just perception. Perception is part of a whole process of insight, of of insight, of realisation, of deep meaning, meaningful study. Of actually, when you connect to these things through perception, or there's connection which allows perception to flow, then there is a very deep, meaningful insight into it all. And you can see, through perception, you can perceive the implications, how it all works, how it all pans out. This happens, why this happens, that happens, something else must happen. And you can see it. You can perceive it all the way down the line. And the long term and the short term, there's no difference because they're all connected. Right? There's no difference. There's no time in perception. You do not have a sense of time when you are perceiving. There is just that moment of perception. And that's why the long term and the short term, they're the same. They're the same. It might take time for the long term to materialise, but it doesn't take time for it to be perceived. You can see the long term. The damage done in the long term. You can see it. You can perceive it. Okay, this is something I wanted to get over because it is very important. It's no good me sitting here putting all these videos up and people say, well, this is great. This is these methods, they get rid of all these problems, these health problems. Yeah, they do. They're very good for that. But unless we mend our ways in the long term, sooner or later these methods will stop working. They'll be overwhelmed like so many other methods have, and we're back to where we started, back to square one. The methods are not just to heal people, they're indicators of we need to change. We need to change, but we cannot change according to a plan or a method, because then we're still in the same place, we're still in the same world. We need to change according to moment by moment perceptions of the process of life, the processes that are around us. We need to tune in, is that the right phrase, tune in? Or join with, join. We need to join with what's going on, which is perception. When you join, you get the perception. When you get the perception, you get the insight, and you get the seeing what needs to happen. But it's constant. You don't just have a flash of it. You're there all the time. If you turn it on, you enter a different world. And if you enter that different world, you stay there. Yeah? You have to, it's like talking to your neighbour over the garden fence. You're in one place, the neighbour's in another place, and you lean over the fence and talk. But it's the same. Once you perceive, you're into a different world. And from that different world, you talk to people who are not in that different world, hoping that they will come into the world as well, come into that different world as well. And then maybe things can start to change. Changing society or the way we do things isn't a long-term goal as such. It is part of the healer's goal, because it's from the society we've created and our actions that the illnesses come. Yeah? We are the author of this, of all this. We've created all this. So we need to look into our environment and everything else to change, to start to change that. Now, before we can change that, we need to change ourselves, and before we can change ourselves, we need to perceive ourselves, perceive the truth of ourselves. So that's it from a healing point of view. Yeah. Right, I'm about talked out. I hope you don't think I'm preaching to you. I'm really trying to point out the differences that simply looking at things in a different way can make. You know, it doesn't have to be either or. It can be both. But the scientific objective method needs to be the 5% that comes in right at the end, just to get it out into the physical world or to give it physical form. But it all has to be worked out and sorted out before thought and analysis and understanding. Understanding is of the world, the physical world. Perception is of the universe. Okay, thanks so much for listening. It's much appreciated. I hope you'll join me on future videos. Thank you.